women initiate about 75% of divorces. And there are multiple reasons for that. What one reason is that women are higher in trait neuroticism. They're more sensitive to negative emotion. So they feel more units of negative emotion subjectively per unit of stress. That's a way of thinking about it. And so they get unhappy faster. Now, why is that? Well, the jury's out on that, but some possible reasons. It seems to kick in at puberty because it's not true for boys and girls. They're smaller, their upper bodies aren't as strong, they're not likely to win physical contests, especially with tough men, despite the Marvel movies. And so the world is more dangerous for them in some sense physically, but I think more importantly is the fact that they are going to bear primary responsibility for dependent infants. And if you have an infant depending on you, you should react to the world as if it's more dangerous than you might if it was just you navigating through it. So now the downside of that for the people who have to live with women and for women themselves is that they're more likely to get upset. They're more likely to make a big deal out of something. Statistically speaking, there's plenty of men who are more neurotic than plenty of women.
Well, you know, there used to be, before the divorce laws were really liberalized, you could sue for irreconcilable differences. And sometimes people do find themselves in that situation. It's like one person wants children and the other person doesn't. It's like, that's a tough one. It's a tough one to negotiate. So I'm certainly not saying that just because you lock yourself into like two cats in a barrel, that will make you solve your problems, because problems are hard to solve and sometimes you can't solve them. I was just pointing out what the cost of leaving the back door open is, and it's a big cost. And you know, one of the things I see too is that people's identities fragment increasingly across time. You know, one of the things that you have as you age is something like the continuity of your life. You know, you have someone that you're with, you've tied your story together with theirs, you have children, maybe they have children. It's like there's this continual payoff, so to speak, in quality that you obtain from staying within that frame. You can jump out of that, and I suppose to some degree that provides freedom, but it isn't obvious to me that it does that for people. There's some additional problems with divorce that people don't really grasp. Like the idea that you can be divorced once you have children, that's kind of a stupid idea, because you can't. You can find a limited substitute for your initial freedom. But if you have kids and you try to get divorced, the probability that that's going to demolish your life is very, very high. First of all, it's incredibly expensive. So one or both of you is going to come out of that poor. And your market value has declined. Let's say you're the woman who takes the kids. Your market value has declined radically. The man, he's just as screwed because he is now an indentured servant and there's no escape from it. And it's not so bad if you can negotiate a peaceful separation, and some people can, but lots of times if you have a terrible relationship, it's not like negotiating a peaceful separation is all that easy. But if you're at each other's throats, good luck to you. I think it's roughly equivalent to having non-fatal cancer. It is not pleasant. It's a 10-year process, 15-year process. It'll cost you $250,000, and it'll tear a big chunk out of your life. And also it will really disrupt your relationship with your kids. And you know, you bring kids into a step-parent family, they do not do as well. Step-parents are not as good parents as biological parents, and the data on that is clear. Now, obviously there are exceptions, because there are terrible biological parents, and there are wonderful step-parents. But if you look in aggregate, it's not that easy to care for children. You need everything you can binding you to them. And if they're someone else's children, mostly they get in the way of the person that you love. Let's say you have a child and I want to go out with you. Every second you spend with that child is the second you don't spend with me. And there's going to be a price for that. I'm not going to be happy about that. And if I have a child, you're going to feel exactly the same way. You might say, well, no, I love children. It's like, yeah, sure you do. I doubt it. And the rate of abuse for kids in step-parent families is way higher than it is in biological families. There's not even any comparison. Each time you have a conflict, you think, should I be in this relationship? Well, that's a big problem because you actually don't know. How much conflict should you have before you shouldn't be in a relationship? And the answer to that is, well, you don't know. Now, there's actually some empirical work on the topic, so I can give you a provisional answer, which is quite interesting. So there was a research psychologist a while back who I thought did a brilliant study, and they had couples record positive events just qualitatively. How many positive interactions did you have with your partner during the day versus how many negative interactions? I don't think they quantified the degree to which they were positive and negative. They're just going to assume that across multiple instances that would wash out. And what they found was, it's quite cool, they found that if you had fewer than 5 positive interactions to every negative interaction, the relationship was going to collapse. So now you can start counting and see if that's appropriate to you. But the other thing they found, which I thought was really lovely, was that if you had more than 11 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction, the relationship was also doomed. And so everyone knows that, because if someone's wandering around treating you like a god or a goddess, the first thing you're going to do is be just contemptuous of them and then completely bored. You want the person to harass you a bit, just so that you learn something, that's part of it. So it's also evidence that there's actually someone there that you're interacting with, you know. Because if someone just does everything you want all the time, well, I mean, that might sound like an ideal fantasy, but you know perfectly well that if that ever happened, you're just going to get completely tired of that instantly. Plus, there's no life in the relationship, right, which is a big issue. Well, the other thing too is you can be sure that in a relationship where there's no conflict, nothing is being decided. Because thought is conflict, even if you do it by yourself. If there are 2 of you in a boat and you're trying to decide where you're going in the future, it's not like that's self-evident. You have to have an opinion, and your partner has to have an opinion, and there's no reason at all to assume that those opinions either will be or should be the same. And then, you know, you hope the relationship is solid enough so that it can withstand the tension of the conflict. One of the things Jung said about marriage, which I thought was, because Jung did a very nice job of trying to understand from a psychological perspective why in the world you should bother being married, which is really a very interesting question. You know, and one of the things he said was that you don't need to tie 2 things together if they'll just stay together of their own accord. So the fact that marriage is a human universal, which it is, indicates that there is enough tension within intimate relationships, centrifugal tension, to blow them apart. And some of that's just because people are different and they clash, but it's also because as you go through life in a single boat, you encounter huge waves and, you know, you might get swamped, so it's a big problem. His point was that the marriage vow was necessary because if your response to potential conflict was, I can leave, you can't have the conflict. If, on the other hand, you're with someone and you think, there's no bloody way I can get rid of you no matter what I do, short of murder, I'm stuck with you for the next 30 years, then we better work this out. And so he thought of that as a container within which a transformation could take place. It was an alchemical motif. And that without that pressure, people weren't going to be sufficiently motivated to really hash out problems.